Welcome back to our news bulletin. Pakistan military says a 2-year-old minor has been martyred while 4 civilians injured in Indian Army's unprovoked cross-border firing. Earlier, 8 civilians were injured due to Indian aggression along the working boundary and line of control. The military's media wing said Indian troops targeted civilians in Baro, Dhuntnial, Rakh Chikri and Chirikot sectors along the line of control. The Inter-Services Public Relations said Pakistan Army effectively responded and targeted Indian posts which initiated the fire. Meanwhile, Pakistan has summoned Indian Charge d'Affaires Gaurav Ahluwalia to register protest over ceasefire violations. Condemning the aggression, Islamabad called these acts in clear violation of the 2003 ceasefire understanding. The people in occupied Kashmir have protested against the Indian Army for using them as a human shield for their aggression against Pakistan. Despite coronavirus pandemic, Indian forces continue unprovoked firing along the border, injuring civilians. The locals in Kupwara district have demonstrated against occupation forces for positioning artillery virtually next to their homes. The residents said the army has started firing on Pakistani posts across the line of control, endangering their lives. Meanwhile, occupied Kashmir is still reeling under India-imposed curfew and communications blackout for 253 days. Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan has asked overseas citizens to donate for government's coronavirus relief fund. In a televised message, Khan said, "Through these donations and Tiger Force, Pakistan will defeat this pandemic." Khan said developed states have allocated trillions of dollars, while Pakistan could only manage $8 billion. He said a website has been launched where overseas citizens can donate for the relief fund. Meanwhile, coronavirus death toll in Pakistan has surged to 93 after 7 people died over the past 24 hours. The health ministry said with 366 new cases, the total number of infections have climbed to almost 5,400, while nearly 1,100 patients have recovered. Meanwhile, the World Health Organization has handed over protective kits to National Disaster Management Authority. Spain's overnight death toll from the coronavirus falls to 517 from yesterday's 619, bringing the total death toll to almost 17,500. Tehran, too, is seeing a glimmer of hope, with the fatal disease claiming 111 lives overnight compared to 171 the day before. The global death toll has crossed 114,000, while more than 1.8 million people have been infected. Spain, one of the countries worst hit by the coronavirus, begins to ease lockdown measures as the rate of new infections and deaths has been falling. An estimated 4.5 million people are returning to work in sectors like manufacturing and construction for the first time in 2 weeks. This week, other European countries like Italy and Austria are also set to loosen restrictions. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom has entered its 4th week of lockdown as the virus has claimed over 10,000 lives there. In Russia, more than 2,550 new cases of coronavirus have been recorded in the past 24 hours, bringing the toll to 18,300. This is the country's largest daily rise in infections so far. Russia has also recorded 148 deaths. Meanwhile, China has reported a total of 108 new coronavirus cases, marking the highest daily toll since the 5th of March. However, officials say almost all were imported. In India, the resident doctors are suffering in the fight against COVID-19 due to inadequate management by the government. The doctors say authorities have crammed up medics in small hostels, making social distancing impossible. The doctors said they are sharing one room with 3 to 4 medics with their mattresses at 1 to 2 feet apart. Meanwhile, truck drivers with essential goods are still stuck at state borders due to shutdown in the country. The drivers are forced to sleep and live inside their vehicles or temporary shelters with little food supply. The Indian Health Ministry has reported 333 deaths and nearly 9,300 coronavirus infections across the country. In another news, the Afghan government says it has released over 360 more Taliban prisoners from the Bagram prison. The Kabul administration earlier released 300 inmates in 3 batches under the Doha peace deal. National Security Council spokesperson Javed Faisal said Kabul will release another 1,500 prisoners under President Ashraf Ghani's order. Meanwhile, the US has welcomed the recent prisoner swap between the Taliban and the Afghan government. US Special Envoy Zalmi Khalilzad says the inmates' release is an important step in the peace process and the reduction in violence. He said the two sides should accelerate efforts to meet targets specified in the US-Taliban Doha agreement as soon as possible. The envoy said potential for COVID-19 outbreaks in prisons poses a real threat. Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif says the unity among different groups in Afghanistan is essential for peace. Zarif made this statement while holding a telephone conversation with his Afghan counterpart Hanif Atmar. The Iranian Foreign Minister emphasized on importance of political structures based on constitution for the stability in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, the Afghan Foreign Minister said two sides agreed to work to build consensus for the ceasefire and peace efforts. Atmar thanked his Iranian counterpart for supporting Afghanistan government's humanitarian ceasefire call. Yemen's Saudi-led coalition says the Houthi rebels have violated the ceasefire agreement more than 240 times in 48 hours. The coalition said the rebels used all kinds of light and heavy weaponry and ballistic missiles while violating the truce. The coalition had declared a ceasefire last week over the COVID-19 pandemic. The coalition said it is adhering to the truce and called on the international community to exert pressure on the Houthis to do the same. Meanwhile, the Houthis claim that they retaliated to the coalition's attacks on Marib and Al-Bayda provinces. Yemen has been entangled in violence and chaos since 2014 after Houthis overran much of the country, including the capital, Sana'a. In Yemen, the Houthi rebels have released over 2,000 prisoners to stem the coronavirus days after the Saudi-led coalition announced a unilateral ceasefire in the country. For its part, the Yemeni government said it had set free over 5,000 prisoners across the country as of April 1st. But the coalition said the rebels are not observing the ceasefire, accusing them of violating the truce several times in the last 2 days. Last week, authorities confirmed the country's first COVID-19 infection in the eastern province of Hadramaut. Yemen's infrastructure, especially its healthcare system, suffers severe deterioration due to the ongoing 6-year conflict between government forces and Houthi rebels. The UN-backed government of National Accord says it has seized Khalifa Haftar's Western Military Command in Surman city. The military says the troops advanced in a surprise attack on Haftar's forces after a night of intense airstrikes. The military said its forces took control of the Haftar forces' investigations headquarters. It said the troops will advance towards Sabratha after gaining the entire control of Surman. The government forces raids are part of the recently launched Operation Volcano Range. Yesterday, the GNA accused the LNA of targeting civilian settlements and medical facilities in Tripoli. 2 people were killed in the strikes. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has replaced more than a third of the country's State Affairs Commission. State media says 5 out of the 13 members of the country's highest decision-making body were changed in the major reshuffle. Former Defense Commander Ri Son-gwan, recently promoted to Foreign Affairs Minister, is one of the newly appointed members. Meanwhile, 2 former foreign ministers were taken off the committee. The step was taken at the annual meeting of the country's Supreme People's Assembly. China says it is not eyeing political gains through its medical cooperation with other countries, rather a new global governance system. In an interview, Chinese envoy to the US, Qiu Tianqi, said Beijing is not trying to become the leader of the world. He said Beijing and Washington should continue to improve bilateral trade ties. Qiu said the outbreak slowed down in China, but the country is working hard to prevent a second wave of infections. He said China cannot succeed in this fight alone. The ambassador called for enhanced international cooperation as the pandemic is a global challenge. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has threatened Hungary with legal proceedings over new laws to slow COVID-19 spread. Earlier this month, Hungary's parliament handed Prime Minister Viktor Orban sweeping decree powers to deal with this crisis.
Hungary's new law suspends parliament and introduces jail terms of up to 5 years for those spreading misinformation. Von der Leyen said imposing emergency measures to combat the virus was necessary, but they have to be proportionate and democratically controlled. While the EU's competition chief has warned of the bloc's businesses being vulnerable that can be subjected to a Chinese takeover. Margrethe Vestager said it's important to be aware of a real risk and EU countries should buy stakes in companies to block the takeover threat. Meanwhile, police in Germany's financial capital Frankfurt were attacked by men with stones and iron bars while violating social distancing measures. Police said officers were attacked when they saw a large group of people on the streets who were blatantly ignoring lockdown rules.
Germany has promised strong leadership to fight COVID-19 pandemic when it will take up presidency of the Council of the European Union on July 1st. The presidency is responsible for functioning of the EU's legislative upper house. In an interview, German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas said after assuming the presidency, the first tasks will be to lift restrictions on travel and internal market. Maas said, if EU leaders learn from the current crisis, the bloc will come out stronger and more unified than ever before. The EU's presidency is currently held by Croatia, that rotates among member states every 6 months. Italy has ordered migrants on board a rescue ship off its coast to be quarantined on another vessel to test them for the COVID-19. German NGO CI's Alan Kurdi is sailing in international waters after rescuing 150 migrants off Libya's coast. Italy's transport ministry said disembarking the migrants without being screened will put pressure on Sicily's already stretched health services. Last week, Italy closed its ports to NGO vessels rescuing migrants in the Mediterranean for the entire duration of national emergency. Russia has released a mobile phone app to grant instant security clearance to those who want to leave their homes during the coronavirus lockdown. But the app has been criticized as a government attempt to track civilians 24/7. Russia's communications ministry says users will register with their passport details and a selfie. Reasons to be out of doors include taking out the rubbish, walking a dog, visiting hospital, caring for someone, or going to work. Human rights campaigners have criticized the app as curbing right to privacy through constant surveillance. But Moscow's Internet Freedom Watchdog urges the monitoring will end once the pandemic is defeated.
Some measures can be justified, but it is up to us to make sure that after the pandemic ends, these measures are lifted. Of course, it is a big threat to human rights. Some may like to gain location data without court permission, and this way stays forever.
We have a lot more coming up right after this short break, so stay tuned. Welcome back. Amnesty International says Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi's government has been persecuting its critics ever since it came into power. The human rights group said more than 300 activists were prosecuted in freedom of expression related cases in 2019 alone. The group said in 16 cases, the military used repressive laws to frame people who criticize members of the armed forces. The rights watchdog said, in Aung San Suu Kyi's Myanmar, the slightest criticism of the authorities can land you in jail. Amnesty called for the immediate exoneration and release of all victims of persecution imprisoned for peaceful dissent. It also called on Myanmar to urgently amend or repeal the long-standing repressive laws used to jail activists and critics. Lockdowns being implemented across the world to contain the coronavirus have left countries' most economically vulnerable citizens without a source of income. This includes Brazil, where sanitation workers are struggling to make ends meet after the virus made its way to the country's shores. Let's find out more about them in this report.
Until recently, this plant has produced 8,000 tons of recyclable material, generating employment for some of Rio de Janeiro's poorest citizens. But the quarantine measures have forced the plant to shut down operations. The sudden change has left most employees unable to feed their families.
Our cooperative receives trash weekly. This week, the staff has nothing left, no money to buy their food and maintain their expenses. Have fun with the collection life today.
One sanitation worker says her fridge has been empty since Brazil started implementing quarantine measures.
It is very difficult right now. When I was working, at the end of the week, I was doing okay. My refrigerator was not full, but it was also not lacking. But now, it is like this.
Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro has repeatedly called for the reopening of the country's economy, saying a recession would be more harmful than the coronavirus. But experts say lifting quarantine measures too early could create a need for an even stricter lockdown.
In the U.S., 6 people have died after a dozen tornadoes ripped through the states of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. Officials said the tornadoes, with winds approaching 200 miles per hour, left behind a path of destruction. The Mississippi Emergency Management Agency confirmed deaths across the counties. Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves declared a state of emergency, saying several tornadoes had struck the state. Strong storms damaged up to 300 homes and other buildings in northern Louisiana. The Weather Service said a broader area from East Texas to the East Coast was under at least a marginal risk of storms. The National Weather Service warned that strong tornadoes and widespread damaging winds are possible for another day. UN Refugee Agency has raised alarm about fate of dozens of migrants whose dinghy is believed to have been capsized. United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees said the migrants were going Italy from Libya. Germany Sea Watch International Group said lost boat was carrying 85 people. 2 German monitors of dangerous migrant crossings first reported spotting 4 boats in distress off the southern coast of Malta over the weekend. EU's Frontex Coast Guard agency later said one of the 4 boats had safely reached Italy and another 2 were still at sea, while the 4th boat was unaccounted for. Pakistan Army says one of its training planes has crashed during a routine training mission near the city of Gujarat. The military's media wing said both pilots on board the aircraft were martyred in the incident. It said instructor Major Umar and student Lieutenant Faizan died on the spot. The Inter-Services Public Relations said Major Umar is survived by a wife. In the Central African Republic, 3 civil wars have left thousands of people handicapped or dealing with poor mental health, but many physically disabled locals have found ways to stay fit and active. One of the most popular forms of exercise is wheelchair basketball. Details in this report.
Life with a disability is difficult anywhere, but it's particularly hard in one of the world's poorest countries. But in the Central African Republic, amputees have found solace in playing wheelchair basketball. Players swing into action using tricks to distract opponents, their wheelchair tires hissing across the court. Most dedicated basketball players have to travel several kilometers under the scorching sun every day.
When you are disabled, you tend to be unable to do anything. But through sport, we can get out of this handicap. We value ourselves like others. Why not go to the Olympic Games like others, like the able-bodied? Why not do great things in sport and even have a job through sport? So it gives us our dignity. It gives us hope.
Coping with prostheses isn't easy either. Amputees have to go through hard training to learn how to walk, find a seat in the bus, or how to climb stairs.
I was amputated because of a bullet, and I was walking on crutches. Now with the prosthesis, I can work with my own hands, take care of my children, and be active in life.
But there are other injuries that aren't as visible as an amputation. The Central African Republic has been through 3 civil wars. which has left countless people suffering from mental health issues. Now, officials are working to build a new center to offer psychological help for people.
Of all the cases we get here, 50% are traumatic cases that are related to the conflict. They come here, we take care of them, then we make them custom prostheses, then we deliver them. Then we do the re-education, how to walk, how the person can use his device.
The World Health Organization estimates that there are 30,000 people dealing with amputation or high stress levels because of conflict in the Central African Republic. But the National Association of Rehabilitation believes the actual figure is likely 3 times higher than the WHO's estimate.
Asian Development Bank has announced it is tripling the size of its coronavirus rescue package to $20 billion. The bank initially announced $6.5 billion for Asia to counter the macroeconomic impact of the pandemic. It said an additional $13.5 billion, including about $2.5 billion in concessional and grant resources. The bank's president, Mataguzgu Azaka, said the scope and the scale of the crisis made it imperative for ADB to expand its support. Earlier this month, ADB warned the pandemic can cost the global economy over $4 trillion. Now let's look at the weather from around the globe. This is all for now. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.